Hello, my name is Michael Levy. I am a co-director of the PASS program. I'd like to welcome everybody to the PASS session for Indian and other international CAs who are interested in achieving their Canadian CPA.
Recording in progress.
Let's start on a positive note. The bottom line is success is achievable. You need patience, you need persistence, you certainly need some hard work, but if you're willing and committed, this is a very passable exam. Keep in mind, this is not like the Indian CA where there's, a single-digit pass rate. The pass rate on the CP is quite high, and people who are bright and hardworking and who are willing to follow the instruction that we provide should be able to pass this exam. And that's why we've had a lot of success so far with, in particular, Indian CAs. Let me begin by explaining what we're going to be covering in this presentation. We're going to start in part one by just giving a bird's eye view of the CPA program and the CP. We'll then deal with case writing and technical. You have to understand that when it comes to the Canadian CPA, there are really two ingredients to passing this exam. You need to know your technical, but you also have to have the ability to write cases effectively. We'll talk about that in part two. In part three, we'll provide a detailed description of the program for Indian students. That will be done primarily by my partner, Ira Wapish. You'll be meeting when we get to part three. Part number four, we'll just talk briefly about schedules. In other words, when are these exams written, when you need to register, etc. In part five, I'd just like to share with you some testimonials from prior students who've taken this course and succeeded. In part six, we'll just speak very briefly about how to register with PASS. And then finally, in part seven, we'll talk about registration with a CPA Provincial Institute. As we'll discuss later, in order to write this exam, depending on where you're going to be writing the exam, you would have to register with one of the provincial institutes. We'll get into more detail when we get to part seven. And then finally, at the end of the presentation, we'll provide you with some contact information in case you have any questions and wish to contact PASS. Let's start with a bird's eye view of the CPA program and the CP. Let me begin by explaining what a typical Canadian student would have to do. And then I can show you the fantastic shortcut that Indian students can take due to the MOU between Canada and India. A typical Canadian student is required to take a number of modules, four modules. Each module is a number of weeks long and involves an exam. One module focuses primarily on financial accounting, it's called Core 1. Another focuses on management accounting, it's called Core 2. And then there are elective modules that students would take. They would then go on to Capstone 1, which involves working on a large business case along with a group. And then after that, they do Capstone 2, where they write previous or old CP cases. And then finally, students can go on to the CP. The nice thing about being an Indian CA is that you can go directly to the CP. And that's what I mean by a shortcut. You don't need to do any of the modules, none of the four modules. You don't have to do even Capstone 1 or Capstone 2. You can go directly to the CP. As we'll discuss later on, Capstone 2 is actually quite beneficial because you get to write prior CP cases, which can help you write your CP. We still are not going to recommend that you attend Capstone 2, but as you'll see later on, PASS does have an alternative to Capstone 2. So you're not at a disadvantage when it comes to writing. We'll get to that later. The 2023 CP will be May 30th to June 1st, and that's for those students who wish to write in May. If you're only planning to write in September, the September CP is from September 12th to 14th. There are actually two sittings for the CP. I don't think that most people watching this video right now are planning to write in 024, but in case you are, I provided dates for the 024 CP. So as you can see, there are two sittings for the CP each year, one in May and one in September. So at the end of the day, basically, a typical student in Canada does their technical modules, moves on to capstone 1 and 2, and then moves on to the CFE. An Indian CA is exempt both from the technical modules as well as capstone 1 and 2, and can move on directly to the CFE. The nice thing about this is if you're located in India, it means just one trip to Canada. Even if you're living in Canada already, obviously it's a wonderful bonus to not have to go through a whole bunch of modules and pass a whole bunch of exams and then go through capstone 1. Basically, there's a huge time savings here. Plus, nobody wants to write more exams than they need to. Let me now give you an overview of the CFE. What exactly is this creature we call the CFE? The CFE, very much unlike the Indian CA exam, is a case-based exam. These cases are not like the Indian exam. On the Indian CA exam, you may have small cases, but here we're dealing with large cases where you're dealing with multiple issues and multiple competencies. By that, I mean multiple subjects. The time for the cases, as we'll see in a moment, can range from as low as 70 minutes to as long as 5 hours. And we'll see in a few minutes the different types of cases. On a short case, a case that's 70 or 80 or 90 minutes, that's relatively short compared to 5 hours. You may need to read 5 or 6 pages. On a long case, that 5-hour case, you may have to read as many as 15 to 20 pages. So this, of course, is one of the challenges that you'll deal with as an Indian CA. The fact that you're not accustomed to these lengthy cases. But keep in mind, you can learn how to deal with these cases. Is it challenging? Certainly. Is it something you can learn overnight? No, you can't learn it overnight. Can you learn it over time? You certainly can. The cases typically have a 1-page main body, approximately 1 page, followed by multiple appendices. So here is an example of what a case might look like. This would be the main body of the case. This is just one example. And then following the main body, you would have multiple appendices. Obviously, the number of appendices you have would typically be a function of how long the case is. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the CFE is 3 days long. When I showed you the sittings for May and September, you saw that it was 3 days long. So let me explain now what the 3 days entail. On day 1, you're going to be writing one big 4-hour case, which is referred to as the comp, and it's based on a capstone 1 module. During the capstone 1 module, which you're not required to attend, but for those who do attend it, all Canadian students must attend capstone 1. During the capstone 1 module, you'll be working on a case and you'll be dealing with high-level business type issues. As I mentioned earlier, strategic and operational issues. When you come to the first day of the CFE, you'll be dealing with exactly the same case as you were dealing with during the capstone 1 module. But now the scenario moves a few years ahead. You're now a few years later, and you're dealing with new issues that same company that you dealt with in the capstone 1 module is now facing. Now, as I tell you this, some of you are probably thinking, but what happens to me? I didn't go to the capstone 1 module. So how am I going to deal with day 1? Later on during Ira's presentation, we'll talk about that. What we'll do at PASS is we will give you all the information you need so that you can deal with day 1 effectively without having attended capstone 1. So in case anybody's concerned about that, I'd like to allay those concerns. On day 2, you're going to write one large 5-hour case referred to as the roll comp. And you'll see in a few minutes why we call it the roll comp. That is somewhat of what I would call an endurance test because it is a very, very long case. And again, it does take practice to learn how to write such a long case. But once again, it seems daunting, but it's certainly very doable. On day 3, you'll be writing 3 short cases, which basically can be anywhere between 70 and 90 minutes, but they have to add up to 240 minutes. They have to add up to 4 hours in total. And Ira and I will often refer to these cases as multis. We refer to them as, the reason we call them multis is they involve multi-competencies. They involve a number of different subjects. So at the end of the day, the cases could be 70 minutes, 75 minutes, 80 minutes, 85 minutes, or 90 minutes, but they have to add up to 240 minutes, the three cases combined. And again, because all of these cases will test more than one competency, i.e. more than one subject. So what are the different competencies / subjects that are examinable on the CP? Audit and assurance, financial reporting, management accounting, finance, taxation, and strategy and governance. And in all 3 days, you will be tested on more than just one competency. Let's take a look now at each day individually. As I mentioned before, day one of the CP, you're writing one large 4-hour case. As I mentioned earlier, the setting is based on Capstone 1 module. So you're dealing with exactly the same company that came up during the Capstone 1 module. The only thing is, you're now a number of years later. It could be 5 or 10 years later, and the company is now facing new strategic and new operational issues. It is marked separately from day 2 and 3 because it's quite different than day 2 and 3. Day 2 and 3 are intended to be very technical, whereas day 1 is more high-level business type decisions. So it's a very different type of exam than day 2 and 3, and therefore it's marked separately using a different type of marking rubric. And you simply get a pass or a fail. And at the end of the day, you can, as we'll see in a few minutes, you can pass, it's marked, because it's marked separately from days 2 and 3. If you, for example, were to fail day 1 but pass day 2 and 3, you would only have to take day 1 over again, not the whole exam. Day 2 of the CFE is one case, which is 5 hours long. That's why I referred to it as a bit of an endurance test. And it's called the roll call. Now, the way that this exam works is as follows. In theory, the case can have just financial accounting or just management accounting or both financial and management accounting. In the last few years, there has always been both financial and management accounting. In addition to financial and management accounting, you will also have numerous requirements that relate to the specific role that you've chosen. And that's why it's called the roll call. There are 4 roles from which you can choose. The 4 roles are audit, tax, performance management, or finance. So on a typical comp in the last few years, you were dealing with management accounting and financial accounting, and then just one other competency depending on what you chose. So if, for example, you chose audit, audit is basically assurance. If you chose assurance, then you were effectively dealing with the following 3 competencies: financial accounting, management accounting, and assurance. If the person sitting next to you chose finance as their role, that individual would have been dealing with financial accounting, management accounting, and finance. Ankura is asking, can we choose out of the 6 subjects? No. The choice is from these 4 areas: audit, tax, performance management, and finance. Because keep in mind, the other 2 subjects, financial accounting and management accounting, everybody has to deal with. So it's only from audit, tax, performance management, or finance from which you would choose your role.
But for the day 1, can I ask one more question here?
Sure.
For the day 1, so the question can be from all the 6 subjects. It can be one of the 6 subjects.
Correct. Correct.
On day 1.
Correct. The only day where you choose a specific role, and therefore you're limited in the number of competencies that can be tested, is day 2. Whether it's day 1 or day 3, any of the 6 competencies can be tested. Ravneet asks, how do we decide on our role competency? How do we arrive at that? That's a very good question. The truth is, most people choose it based on what they think they're strongest at. So if you feel that you're very strong at assurance, you might choose assurance. If you feel you're very strong at finance, you might choose finance. Some people also base it on the area they're working in. Sometimes the 2 go hand in hand. Like if somebody's been working in finance for years, they may not even remember their assurance any longer, so they may prefer finance. So it's really very much a personal thing. I have many students who actually call me to help them make that decision, and I'm always happy to do that. What I'll sometimes tell a student if they're not sure is to take a look at the roles on a real comp, take a look at the finance role, take a look at the assurance role, and see which one you're more comfortable with if you're not sure. But again, I'm always happy to assist you if you're not sure which role to choose. The reason, by the way, I used assurance and finance as my examples is among Indian CAs, I find that the most popular roles are finance and assurance. Very few Indian CAs choose tax simply because the Tax Act in Canada is so radically different from the Act in India. So I don't know if you might have had one or two Indians choose tax in all the years we've taught. And then performance management, we do have a few people choose. But I would say finance and assurance are the most popular among Indian CAs. Day 3 of the CP, each case would contain anywhere from 4 to 6 competencies. So you can sometimes have a case where all 6 competencies are tested, but generally at least a minimum of 4. As we mentioned earlier, on day 3, you do not choose a role. Everybody writes exactly the same cases. Day 2 and 3 are marked together. So the nice thing is that if you, for example, are unsuccessful on day 2 or 3, but you were successful on day 1, you'd only have to write day 2 and 3 again, and vice versa. So at the end of the day, day 1 is marked separately from day 2 or 3. So if you pass one of those, basically you're not going to have to write it again. Here are some key facts about the CP. Everyone in Canada writes the same exam. It's a national exam. So even though you're registering with a provincial institute, that's just for registration purposes. It's purely administrative. But at the end of the day, you're writing exactly the same exam, whether you register in British Columbia or Ontario. You have 3 attempts to pass, which should not be a problem because, again, many Indians pass on their first try. Some require a second try. I really don't recall, and again, maybe if I recall, he can tell you, but I honestly can say that I do not recall any Indian CA calling me after 3 attempts and saying I didn't pass. I have no such recollection, so I don't think that should be a big issue. The exam is written on computer using Word and Excel, but the actual exam paper is physical. So you're given a physical exam, but you're not writing it with a pencil and paper. You're writing it using Word and Excel. Okay, Mohammed asks, is it possible to appear in May Day exam and then again in September, day 2 and 3 exam? That is something that I think Ira and I have discussed this. From our discussions with the Institute, they do not encourage that. They do not, if you don't pass in May, they do not encourage you to write in September. They encourage you to write the following year. Do you want to add something, Ira?
Yeah, Michael, I think what Mohammed is asking is not whether or not a person is successful in May. Mohammed is asking, can you take day 1 in May?
Oh, I'm sorry.
And then day 2 and 3 in September.
Oh, I misread that. I apologize. I misread that. You're right. I don't believe you can do that.
I don't think they want you to do that. There may be some emergency situation where someone was able to write day 1 and then, I don't know, there was some emergency and they could not write day 2 and day 3, but those would be one-off cases.
Yeah. But
no, they do not want you to do part of the exam in May and part of the exam in September.
The exam is open book. By that I mean you have an electronic copy of the handbook in front of you. That would include, the handbook in Canada includes both assurance as well as financial accounting. So you have that in front of you. You also have access to the Canadian Tax Act. It's unlikely that you'd be accessing the Tax Act during your exam because it's a very, very difficult act to read, but it's quite likely that you would be accessing the handbook during your exam. Because it's a national exam, it doesn't really matter in which Canadian province you write the exam. At the end of the day, because it's a national exam, I can write my exam in British Columbia or Alberta or Manitoba. These are Western provinces. And then I can go and I can practice in Ontario. So it really doesn't matter where you write your exam. Once you pass the exam, because it's national, you can write throughout you can practice throughout the country. Does anybody have any questions before I move on to the importance of case writing and technical? Oh, one second. I think I've missed a question. Oh, Oh, yeah, I don't, Flanil is asking, I hope I'm not asking a repeat or already known question. Is it possible to do CPA Canada from Bahrain? Yes, well, let me explain that. You can certainly register and do your studying while you're in Bahrain, and you can certainly take the complete pass course while you're in Bahrain. However, when it comes to writing the CP, you'd have to come to Canada. Okay, now the Canadians have, the CPA Canada has been talking now for some time about eventually offering the exam outside Canada, but right now you have to write the exam in Canada. But again, you can do all of your prep from outside Canada. And as a matter of fact, as we'll see later on, some of the past sessions some of the past online sessions are actually based on Indian time so that people in Bahrain or India can attend at a normal hour. Sahil asks, will the maximum 3 attempts be counted subject-wise? I'm not sure what that means, Sahil. Maybe you could just orally explain what you mean. Sahil? I'm not sure what the question means. Okay. Okay.
Hi, Michael. I am not sure what the question is, but as for what I understand, Sahil is saying that the different subject, I believe he's considering it as a paper on one subject, which is not the case with CP, and he's saying is maximum 3 attempts be counted subject-wise.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. So at the end of the day, because the exam is not a subject-based exam, you don't write an exam on assurance and then another exam on financial accounting. It doesn't work that way. So the whole question is somewhat moot because you don't pass a particular subject. So that's just not going to come up the way that the exam is designed. Okay.
Yeah,
now,
Michael, just let me, sorry,
sure.
just let me add one thing. Sahil, I think what you're getting at is it does not work like if I choose for day 2 assurance 1 year and then I fail, but then the next year I choose tax, will I now have 3 chances for tax? The answer is no. You have 3 chances regardless of which subject you choose on day 2. So if I choose assurance 1 year and I fail, and then I choose tax next year and I fail, that's 2 attempts.
Coming back now to, I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Gagan or Gagan, I apologize if I'm massacring your name. As far as the PR goes, you don't need a PR to write. I mentioned earlier that I'd rather deal with visa questions at the end just because they're not relevant to our Canadian students. But the short answer is you do not need a PR to write, but depending on where you're writing, you may need a certain type of visa. You may need a study and or work visa. So, but you definitely don't necessarily have to have your PR. But again, we can talk about this in more detail if you don't mind at the end of the session. Just please remind us at the end of the session. Your second question is relevant to everybody. You ask in your second question, you know, given that you're not taking the technical modules or capstone 1 or 2, how can we prepare for exam day 1? So I'm actually going to expand your question to how can I prepare for exam day 1, 2, and 3? Because the truth is, your question is an excellent question. And the bottom line is the fact that you didn't do the technical modules doesn't just affect day 1. It actually affects day 1 less than it affects day 2 and 3. Day 2 and 3 are really the technical days. So you're not doing the technical modules really affects day 2 and 3 more. It's really not doing capstone 1 that affects day 1. So let me deal with all 3 days. As far as day 1 goes, I mentioned earlier, day 1 is very non-technical. You're dealing with high-level business issues. So the main challenge on day 1 is learning, number 1, how do I write this type of case, which is very different than anything you encounter on the Indian CA. And the second challenge is the fact that you haven't been to capstone 1, and day 1 is based on capstone 1. So the way that we deal with that is, number 1, we give you a summary of the key information you need to know from capstone 1 in order to be successful on day 1 of the CP. We also have a whole session on how to approach the day 1 case in which an instructor who is an expert on Capstone 1 and Day 1 actually not only teaches you the approach, but walks through a sample Day 1 case with you. When it comes to Day 2 and 3, that is where you're not having done the technical modules could be an issue if not for PASS. People who go to the technical modules are prepared when it comes to financial accounting, management accounting, and the other competencies. Because you didn't go to these days, what we do is PASS provides a very, very comprehensive technical review, which pretty much covers off everything you would have otherwise covered in these technical modules. So we will prepare you from a technical perspective. Also bear in mind, and this should give you some level of confidence, that you're not starting from scratch. Remember, a Canadian student is starting from scratch. One of the reasons why you're exempt from the technical modules is because you already have an Indian CA. So if you already have an Indian CA, keep in mind, you already have a fair amount of knowledge of financial accounting, management accounting, etc. So we're not starting from scratch. What we're trying to do here at PASS is two things. Number one, teach you those areas that are different in Canada than in India, like tax, financial accounting. We have special standards for private enterprise that are unique to Canada. So number one, we'll fill you in on what you never learned in India. And then we'll also do a technical review of all the areas you did learn in India, but where you've had enough time to forget them, right? I don't know how many years ago, each of you wrote the exam at a different time. Some of you probably didn't write the Indian exam for years. So again, we'll provide a very comprehensive technical review to refresh your memory on all of these subjects. So at the end of the day, through the PASS course, you will be prepared from a technical perspective for the exam. You ask if there's any book available for CPA exam preparation. What we'll be doing at PASS is we will be giving you a very comprehensive binder that you can use for the exam. So you really shouldn't need many other books. Some people do like to occasionally refer to textbooks, but we'll be providing you with a comprehensive binder. Let me see the next question. And then on top of that, somebody, I'm just taking a look over here, as you can see, in addition to that, you'll also be getting ebooks from CPA Canada for each of the 6 competencies. So if there's something that isn't clear to you in the PASS binders, you can always go to these ebooks. So the combination of the PASS binder and the ebooks, should provide you with a fair amount of study material. These ebooks are provided to you by CPA Canada. So you'll be getting it directly from the Institute, not from PASS. Let me move now on to part 2 of the presentation, which is case writing and technical. As I mentioned at the outset of the presentation, this exam is very different than the Indian exam insofar as you're writing large cases. So one of the skills you need to master in order to write this exam successfully is case writing skills. You have to learn how to write cases. Now, when it comes to learning how to write cases, my experience has been that it takes most people a fair amount of time. It's not like studying technical, where you can sit down one afternoon and study a particular technical subject and master it, or over 2 or 3 days master it. It doesn't work that way with cases. With cases, you have to write the cases over a fair amount of time, and eventually it clicks. Eventually, you start to understand the thought process. So that is why I always tell students, and I would tell students the same thing, the earlier you start writing cases, the better off you are. Because the truth is, everybody's different. Some people get the hang of writing cases more quickly than others, but it's not a question of intelligence. You could be the Indian gold medalist, but it doesn't mean you're going to learn how to write cases quickly. Some people just take longer than others. So at the end of the day, the earlier you start your case writing, the better. That's why you'll see when Ira goes over the PASS course that we have one version of the course which starts very early, and we always recommend that people take that version. Ideally, it's great if you can start your studying about a year in advance. So if you're planning to write next September, it'd be great if you could start now. But again, the bottom line is, even if you're writing in May, if you started now, you'd be okay. But we certainly wouldn't say to somebody, 2 months before the CP, you've got enough time to learn how to write cases. That certainly is not the case. And one of the nice things about this exam is you can do the studying while you're working. The vast majority of people writing this exam are working while they're studying. So you can make a living while you're studying. Now, the bottom line is you don't necessarily break up your practice case writing and your technical. It's not like you sit there and you spend 6 months studying technical and then you finally start your case writing. It doesn't work that way. You can certainly, if you start early enough, you can certainly spend the first month or two just doing technical. But after that, what you would be doing is you'd be studying your technical along with your case writing. That is how most people study. As a matter of fact, you're going to learn a certain amount of technical from the case writing. When it comes to technical, the two areas that are most heavily tested are financial accounting. Now, in financial accounting, as I believe I mentioned a moment ago, in Canada, we've got two types of accounting. We've got ASPE and IFRS. And let me explain why we have both. The way that it works in Canada is public companies have to use IFRS. And many of you are probably familiar with IFRS from India. But private companies are allowed to use a special type of accounting which was specifically designed for private enterprises in Canada by CPA Canada, and that's what I'm referring to by ASPE. Both ASPE as well as IFRS can be tested on the CP in financial accounting. Financial accounting and management accounting are the two most heavily tested areas on the exam. And that's why these are going to be major areas of focus for you. I've noticed there are some questions in the chat box, but why don't I finish this section and then I'll come back to the chat box. Now, before I move any further, even though financial accounting and management accounting have equal weighting on the exam, so they have to test as much management accounting as they test financial accounting, typically you would be focusing more time on financial accounting simply because the body of knowledge is much larger. The body of knowledge in management accounting isn't terribly huge. The body of knowledge of financial accounting is quite large. So they're both equally tested and they're both equally weighted on the exam, but a typical student would certainly devote more time to financial accounting than management accounting. I should also mention that the nice thing about management accounting is it's universal. It's not going to be any different in Canada than India. Now, one area that's always new to Indian CAs is tax, because the Tax Act, as I mentioned earlier, is quite different in Canada than India. I have no expertise whatsoever on the Indian Tax Act, but I know enough to know that it's completely different. So that's the one area you're more or less learning somewhat from scratch. But the good news is that tax comes up from a really technical perspective on day 3. On day 2, as long as you don't choose tax as your role, and I mentioned earlier, hardly any Indian CAs will ever choose tax as their role, you will never be tested on tax in a great deal of depth. Because the only time they can test tax in a lot of depth is on day 2, and most Indians, virtually all Indians, do not choose it on day 2. They can test tax from a technical perspective on day 3, but they tend to test it at a relatively basic level. You certainly need to know basic compliance. There's no question about that. But they're not going to test the intricacies, the complexities of tax planning on day 3. Will they test it on day 2? Certainly. But again, very few Indian CAs will ever encounter it on day 2 because Indian CAs do not generally choose tax as their role. So you do need to be comfortable with computing taxable income, both from a corporate as well as a personal perspective. You need to know what's deductible, what types of expenses are deductible, both from a corporate as well as a personal tax perspective. You know, you need to know what types of benefits are taxable, versus what benefits are not taxable. But this is not terribly difficult because it's at a relatively basic level. Now, what about audit, finance, and governance? The last 3 subjects or competencies are audit, which is assurance, finance, and strategy and governance. What I find is that when it comes to assurance, most of what you need to know you learn from case writing. Because at the end of the day, a large part of assurance is, I think, somewhat intuitive. When you're dealing with planning an audit, for example, carrying out procedures, dealing with control weaknesses in controls, you learn that from case writing and, quite frankly, to some degree from intuition and common sense. There are a few areas of assurance where you really do have to study them, like, for example, reporting. There you have to go through the past notes and study that. But a large part of assurance, a very big chunk of it, you're going to learn through case writing. Finance is very narrowly tested on the CP. It's primarily quantitative. And again, it's fairly basic, okay? I did an MBA in finance, and I would say the level at which finance is tested on the CP is probably lower than the very first finance course, the introductory finance course at MBA school. So it's really not at a very high level, and that's why a large part of that you can learn from case writing. We will give you notes on finance, and I'd recommend you go over them, but it won't take you very long to study the technical because, again, unless you choose it as your role on day 2, it will not be tested at a very high level. Those of you who choose it as your role on day 2, there it is tested at a fairly high level. But again, I find that the only students who choose finance as their role on day 2 are students who are strong in finance to start with. Otherwise, you don't choose it as your role. Finally, when it comes to strategy and governance, quite frankly, it's simply a matter of common sense. Strategy and governance usually comes up in cases in the context of giving basic business advice. So you're just using your basic common sense and business acumen. It's not something where you're going to do very much in the way of technical study. Before I pass over the presentation to Ira, why don't we go back and just take a look at the questions in the chat box, and then Ira will take over the presentation. So Jaren asks, I can use the binders to prepare if I'm outside Canada. That is correct. You certainly can.
Okay, I thought Ira will be taking over, so I stopped. Okay,
Oh, no problem. Oh, no problem. Yeah, if you could just continue the recording, please. And then while Ira loads his presentation, we'll stop the recording. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at Ravneet's question. And again, it was written to me, so I'll read it out to everybody since no one else can see it. Ravneet asks, if we start, say, a year before, how many months should we devote for technical first before moving on to case writing, although understanding that technical is an ongoing process? Okay, so the bottom line is, let's take a real life example. Let's say you're planning to write next September. And let's say today, following the presentation, you were to register with PASS. We would give you access to the technical binder immediately. And what I usually would tell students is I would say the formal part of the course in which you're going to actually be writing cases and having them professionally marked, if you're writing in September, doesn't start till January. So I would say to you, if you're writing in September, between now and January, I would say devote a fair amount of time to boning up your technical. We'll give you a few practice cases to write on your own. But in addition to writing a few practice cases, I would say devote a large part of your time to technical. Come January, you'll be devoting a lot more of your time to case writing, and you'll continue to develop your technical through the case writing. And Kurt, everybody can see his questions. If we register now, will 3 attempts be counted continuously beginning May 22, given the travel restrictions? No, if because of travel restrictions, you're not able to write, that doesn't count as an attempt. Is that what you're asking, Ankur? Was that your question?
My question was, if I register now and my first attempt is in May 22, do I have to give May 22, September 22 and May 23 also only? Or because of the travel conditions, I can write it afterwards also?
Yeah, okay. It doesn't, to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter whether there are travel restrictions or not. You don't always have to write 3 consecutive sittings. Even without travel restrictions, you can write the first time in September of 2022, then write again in September, full year. You don't have to then write the following May. You can then write the next September if you want. And then if for some reason you can't write the following September, you can write 2 years later. In other words, it doesn't have to be consecutive sittings. Do you see what I mean? You just have 3 attempts, period. If I'm not mistaken, I think you have to finish the whole process in, I think, 6 years. Have you heard that, Ira? I think it's 6 years. But you have a long time in which to do those 3 attempts.
Right.
Okay, let's continue. Yes, tax definitely means Canadian tax. Okay, Microsoft Excel and business report writing, does paper consist of only direct tax or indirect tax as well? Okay, that's a good question. Yeah, but when you say indirect tax, you mean like sales? Yeah, well, we have in Canada what I believe you call indirect taxes. We would call HST and GST here. In other words, these are taxes that are not on income, but when you make purchases. So yes, you do have to have some knowledge of what you're calling indirect taxes. But most of tax, the vast majority of what you'll be studying will relate to income taxes, either corporate or personal. Sahil asks, what's the pass percentage generally on the CP? I'll be honest with you, I cannot give you an exact percentage. It's very, very difficult because we have students taking parts of the course, and it's just very, very difficult for us to harness that to tell you precisely. But what I can tell you is that number one, we do know our pass rates when we teach for in-house programs. And for example, I mentioned earlier that we do the national program at PwC, and Ira will be mentioning that later. The bottom line is that there we know the pass rate is very, very high. For Indian CAs, it probably is somewhat lower just because, you know, you didn't train in Canada. And again, I can't give you an exact percentage, but what I can tell you is that a large number of them make it through. We're very, very pleased with the number of Indian CAs who are making it through this exam. Quite honestly, the rate has exceeded our expectations.
Sahil, the overall pass percentage for Canadians is 74%.
No, that's for that's not for pass. Oh, I'm sorry, you're asking for the CP in general.
Right.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it obviously varies from year to year, but it's generally going to be, it's generally quite high. It's much, much higher than in India, right? And we're not talking about single digit pass rates like in India. Okay. Can we get this PowerPoint after the seminar? Certainly. You're going to be providing it, are you not? I believe
yes, I believe it was sent today morning, but I'll check to those who have not received, or we can send it a second time as well to all the participants who registered for this.
Yeah, because today I don't get an email from the application. No?
It's okay. We'll look into it, but you can definitely get the copy of this presentation.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, Ravneet sent, I'm just going to read Ravneet's question because it was only sent directly to me. Is there any leverage on choosing finance over audit, as it is a practical competency over audit, which seems to be a theoretical competency? To be honest with you, neither competency is theoretical. For the most part, this is not a theoretical exam. So whether you choose finance or assurance, you're dealing with practical situations. So I don't think there's much of a difference in that respect. That's why I would choose assurance versus finance based on your own personal strengths, because they're both going to be very practical. One major difference, however, between the two competencies is finance tends to be very numerical and assurance is not very numerical. But otherwise, they're both very practical. Okay, let me just see the next question. I'm having... Okay, in terms of a recording, somebody is asking about whether there'll be a recording that's sent. Would it be possible to send everybody a recording?
Yes, we can send the recording. We sometimes definitely do, but it will take 1 or 2 days. So Adil or everyone will be sharing the recording. It might take a day or 2.
Okay, great. Okay, I think I skipped some questions. Let me just go back. I think I missed some questions. Okay. Somebody asks, in case of tax, what is the cutoff date for the updates covered in the exam? Typically, the way the exam works is, let's say you write in May or September of 2022, the cutoff date would be December 31st of the previous year. So if you're writing in May or September 22, you'd be responsible for the Tax Act, any changes in the Tax Act up until December 31st, 2021. So the cutoffs are always based on December 31st of the previous year for the Tax Act. Okay, let's just take a look at the next question. The CP exam, no, it is not offered online. It's offered in person. That's why you need to come to Canada to write it. Is there any practical training after the CP? Yeah, the way it works after the CP is in order to maintain your CPA, you do need to do a certain number of hours of professional development every year. And again, both the CPA Canada as well as private companies provide training for personal development post-qualification. Let's just take a look. When you ask how many, Lenil says, how many of the 4 exams can we select? I'm not sure what 4 exams you're referring to. I don't know if you would you mind speaking up and maybe explaining the question?
Hi, Michael. I don't
Hi.
know if this is a very basic question, but I did hear you saying that we can choose from finance, assurance, performance management, or assurance. So do we need to select one of the 4, or can we select more? How does that work?
No, you would only select one role. This completes part 1 of the past session for Indian CAs who wish to obtain their Canadian CPA. In part 1 of the session, we covered off an overview of the CPA program, as well as going over what the CFE comprises, the common final exam comprises. We also talked about preparing for the CFE, both from a case writing as well as from a technical perspective. In part 2 of the session, which comprises a separate video, my partner, Ara Walfish, will go over points 3 through 8. He's going to give you a description of the past CP program that was designed specifically with Indian CAs in mind to help them get through the CP. He'll also talk about scheduling. When should you write the exam? How much time do you need? He'll show you just 3 or 4 testimonials from past Indian CAs who've taken the PASS course. And then he'll just talk very briefly about how to register with PASS as well as with the CPA Provincial Institute. He'll also give you contact information both for PASS as well as our Indian affiliate, Orbit. If you'd like to watch part 2 of the session, please click on the icon at the top right of this YouTube video. I hope you enjoyed this video.